Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 102, To Kreva. Algirdas died in 1377 after a mostly successful reign in which he expanded Lithuanian control over the Ruthenian Kняжества, including by procuring the placement of his family on the thrones of many of them. However, the Grand Duchy still faced serious problems. The question of how a pagan empire could rule Orthodox and Catholic subjects and build its relations with its neighbours from the two branches of Christianity was becoming ever more acute. The Teutonic Order had emerged from a period of weakness and stagnation to new dynamism under Grand Master Winrich von Kniprod. Annual crusades wreaked havoc along the Lithuanian border, keeping Kęstutis busy defending the land. We heard a few episodes back about Polish and Hungarian cooperation in Galicia and Volhynia. The agreement between the heirless Kazimierz of Poland and King Louis of Hungary, also to acquire the sobriquet of the Great, had been realized, and Louis now ruled both countries. He brought a new Polish-Hungarian army to Volhynia, and Lyubartas was forced to swear allegiance. In the east, as we've heard, Algirdas had marched on Moscow 3 times, tried to build influence in Novgorod and Tver and pull them away from the Grand Knyaz's sphere, but had failed to achieve anything decisive in his military campaigns, and had had only limited success in pulling the Eastern Kняжества into his orbit. The question of an Orthodox metropolitan for the Orthodox believers under Lithuanian rule remained up in the air. So, despite inheriting a Grand Duchy that was substantially bigger and stronger than it had ever been, Algirdas' heir faced significant headwinds, and he would also have to deal with the usual succession problems. That heir was Jogaila, the eldest son by Algirdas' second marriage to Juliana of Tver, who was around 25 years of age at the time of his father's death. He faced problems with his half-brothers and with his uncle, Kęstutis. The Lithuanian Gediminids, who became knyazes, usually had Rus mothers, who did not give up their orthodoxy when they married and made sure that their children had some kind of familiarity with it. Becoming knyaz was often conditional on baptism into orthodoxy, although the extent to which individuals abandoned their previous paganism varied. Jogaila quickly found himself at odds with his elder Orthodox half-brothers. But he was strong enough to deal with them, and he solved the problem by forcing their replacement with his younger pagan full-brothers. Skiergaila took Andrei's place as Knyaz of Polotsk. This was when Andrei and his ally and brother Dmitry, Knyaz of Bryansk, fled to Moscow. Although Dmitry Donskoy welcomed them into his protection, he was not able to help them recover their former status. Not that this helped Skiergaila very much. It turned out that the boyars were not willing to accept a pagan knyaz, so they expelled him. Skiergaila tried converting in order to recover the throne, but it was no good. Kestutis was more of a problem. Many see him as having effectively shared power with Algirdas, and he had decades of experience fighting the knights. The historiography has tended to cast their conflict as Kestutis, the traditionalist, a staunch pagan, uncompromising enemy of the Teutonic Order, against the younger, more flexible Jogaila. Jogaila opened talks with the Order without consulting his uncle, and when he reached an agreement in 1381, Kestutis took him by surprise in Vilnius and imprisoned him. Then he forced Jogaila to abdicate as Grand Duke, while leaving him Kreva and Vitebsk, his personal hereditary duchies. Jogaila's younger brother, Kaributas, who was Knyaz of Novgorod-Siversky, joined Jogaila in resisting Kestutis. They were supported by the merchants of Vilnius, who were happy to see an agreement with the Order. Together, they recovered the capital. Jogaila called on his agreement with the Order, and they laid siege to Kestutis' seat in Trakai. That brought Kestutis hurrying back from the south, while his son, Vytautis, marched to join him with the surviving remnant of the army that had lost Vilnius. By the beginning of August 1382, they were facing off outside the city. Jogaila sent messengers asking Kestutis and Vytautis to come into Trakai for talks, which they agreed to do. But when they arrived, it was their turn to be imprisoned. "5 days later, Kestutis' body was found in a cell in Kreva. His body was burned in a big pagan funeral ceremony. A story that he had committed suicide was put out, but rumour had it that he'd been killed by Skirgaila. True or not, Skirgaila became the new Duke of Trakai. The son, Vytautas, escaped disguised as a female servant. He and Jogaila had been close friends since childhood, and it's quite possible that Jogaila arranged their escape. Vytautas sought refuge with the Teutonic Order, who were happy to pick up a bargaining chip. To return him to Lithuania, they demanded that Jogaila hand Western Samogitiya over to the Order, accept Catholic baptism, both for himself and his subjects, and conclude a formal alliance against the Order's enemies. Jogaila agreed at first, but then decided the price was too high and chose war. The Order resumed its raids into Lithuania, burning Kaunas in 1384. Meanwhile, Jogaila sent word to Vytautas that he was free to return, which he did. He accepted Orthodox baptism and recovered some of his former holdings. Jogaila's eastern problems were at least as difficult to resolve as those with the Order. A lasting peace settlement with Moscow would have required either a resounding military defeat of the Grand Knyaz, which Algirdas had failed to get close to in 3 campaigns, or accepting conversion to Orthodoxy and acknowledging Muscovite seniority, calling Dmitry Donskoy elder brother, as Moscow's subordinate knyazes did. That would have been too much to ask at any time. It was doubly so as Lithuania appeared at the time to be a bigger and stronger state. In the Russian imperial narrative, there was a story that Jogaila did approach Dmitry Donskoy, conducting negotiations to marry his daughter and be baptized. However, these claims were based on forged documents from the 17th century, and nothing of the sort appears to have happened. As we've heard, Jorgaila tried to ally with Mamai against Dmitry Donskoy. This raises a number of questions that we don't have the answers to. If the Lithuanians had made it to the battle, would the outcome have been different? Everything we know suggests that it was a hard-fought and close-run thing. Did Jorgaila purposely fail to turn up? As I mentioned, some scholars believe that Cyprian played a role, persuading Jorgaila to be late to the battle as part of his efforts to build a rapprochement between Moscow and Lithuania to preserve the unity of the church. We will probably never know for sure. What we can say, though, is that Tokhtamysh gave Lithuania a reprieve. With Moscow sacked and some of the knyazhества detached again from Moscow's leadership, Dmitry had his hands full with internal issues, and any new war with Lithuania was out of the question. The last of Jogaila's big problems was Poland. Poland had been having quite a few problems of its own, which we've covered in the members' episodes, but it had now recovered its strength. Lithuania had had similar relations with Poland to those it had with its eastern neighbours. They had tried dynastic marriages as a basis for friendship. Gediminas had married his daughter, Aldona, baptized as Anna, to Kazimierz. Both rulers had wished to strengthen the Polish-Lithuanian alliance against the Teutonic Order. For a while, it was a success. Poland and Lithuania combined to attack Brandenburg the following year, but the outcome of the campaign was inconclusive, and the alliance petered out within a few years. Relations between them did remain peaceful for several more years after that, but then Aldona, still only in her late 20s, died suddenly, and that was that. For several generations, from Gediminas to Algirdas and Kęstutis to Jorgaila, diplomatic relations with Poland had revolved around the question of converting to Catholicism. The Lithuanian rulers several times gave the appearance that they had agreed to do so. The Pope had even sent envoys to Gediminas to get it done, but each time they pulled back. One driver was their success. As we've heard, these leaders were remarkably successful. Kęstutis had, for the most part, reduced the order to ineffective border skirmishing, while Gediminas and Algirdas had dramatically expanded their territory and incorporated vast swathes of Ruthenian land into the Grand Duchy. No one would have wanted to jeopardize that success by suddenly switching religious allegiance. What if it turned out that the old gods were stronger? It was not a question of lack of information. By this point, Lithuania was entirely familiar with both Latin and Orthodox Christianity. Algirdas had married 2 Orthodox wives, and the children of the first were Orthodox themselves. Other Gediminas ruling Orthodox subjects had been converting for decades. Despite restrictions on proselytization that had occasionally resulted in martyrdoms, Catholic priests were constantly present in Vilnius, and there was a growing, if discreet, Catholic community, with both noble and common adherents. Jorgaila would have been as familiar as anyone. Besides his Orthodox mother, he was friends in his youth with Petros Philagos, a Franciscan missionary who later became Pope. He placed commissions for religious art in Poland and Byzantium from the earliest days of his reign. And, from the outset, he was looking for a Christian wife. Despite the history of marrying East in his family, that was not a priority. None of the problems we've discussed could be solved by marrying another Rus princess. It would not help to fulfill the Grand Duchy's ambitions to rule all the Rus lands, since experience showed that it would only help relations with the bride's home knieżeństwo. Converting to Orthodoxy would place him under the authority of the Metropolitan in Moscow, his main strategic rival. The ruling families of Western Europe were out of reach. They would not negotiate a marriage with a pagan, and the Crusade still complicated things. That left Poland. However, there were other issues in Poland. Skiergaila travelled to Mazovia and Hungary. In 1380. Usually it is assumed for the purpose of scouting a wife, but he found Poland's future was rather unclear. As expected, Kazimierz had died without an heir, and, as expected, his designated successor, Louis of Hungary, had become King of Poland. This was purely a personal union of the crowns. It did not assume any merger of the kingdoms, but it did make Poland the junior partner. Nobody liked being the junior partner, and the Polish nobility certainly did not. The move had been unpopular since the beginning. Kazimierz had essentially had to bribe them to support Louis. When Louis succeeded, he made the situation worse. He had little personal interest in Poland other than resources and anything else he could extract. He never visited. He appointed his mother, Kazimierz's sister Elizabeth, to be his governor. This further infuriated the nobility, who were used to having direct influence on the king. And Louis also had his own succession problems. He had 3 daughters, but no sons. Polish law did not provide for women to rule, which meant that Louis would need the nobility's consent to change the rules. The Polish nobility, known as the Szlachta, again forced the biggest concessions that they could manage. They limited the king's tax rights and obtained a veto over financing, as well as securing the right of Poles alone to hold high office and removing their obligations to fight for the king. Effectively, they killed the centralized monarchy in Poland. Louis thought that these concessions had opened the way for his eldest daughter, Mary, to follow him onto the throne of both kingdoms. But when he died, the Szlachta rose up in opposition once again. The problem was not so much Mary, but her husband, future Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg. He was close to the Teutonic Order and likely to take their part in any dispute. He would once again push Poland down into a secondary position, and he was unlikely to be receptive to Szlachta influence. What the Polish elites wanted was to break with Hungary and have their own ruler in Krakow. So, while Mary was quickly crowned in Hungary, the Szlachta held an assembly and sent their conditions of succession. No absentee landlord. If a daughter of Louis wanted to rule in Poland, they would have to live there Soon after, several Polish nobles put themselves forward as candidates for king, without any gaining sufficient backing to close the deal. Now Elizabeth played her hand. She broke with Hungary and offered her and Louis's younger daughter, Jadwiga, as candidate, saying that she would bring the young girl to Krakow when she turned 12. The Szlachta accepted the proposal, but as time passed, factions began to appear as ambitious nobles again tried to put themselves forward. Fighting broke out in places. Elizabeth was forced to bow to the pressure and took Jadwiga, just 10 years old, north to Krakow. On 16th October 1384, she was crowned as Rex Polonae. Not Regina, for those who know the Latin, because she was being crowned as monarch, not consort. But who needs a 10-year-old queen? Elizabeth was a strong regent, but minors on the throne are always a liability. That meant Jadwiga needed a husband. Here, Poland's interests aligned with Lithuania's, beyond simply each having a young ruler in search of a spouse. Poland had no options among its other neighbours. The Germans and the Teutonic Order were enemies. Bohemia was with them, and they'd only just managed to extricate themselves from the clutches of Hungary. Leaving aside the resolvable matters of religion and Volhynia, Lithuania was the only option. In January 1385, Skiergaila arrived in Poland to begin negotiations with a delegation of Szlachta headed by Spitek of Melstein. One obstacle was the existing betrothal of Jadwiga to William Habsburg of Austria, arranged by Louis before his death. This was dealt with an indemnity, which William declined to collect. By August, the other terms of a prenuptial treaty had been agreed. The parties travelled to Kreva, then a border castle, now a ruin in Belarus, near the border with Lithuania. For Lithuania, Jogaila, 3 of his brothers, and his cousin, Vytautas, signed. For Poland, Elizabeth was the signatory. Jogaila, who signed the agreement, treating all of Lithuania as his personal property, swore that he would accept baptism as a Catholic and also require his boyars to do so. That beyond his personal commitment, he would lead the official conversion of Lithuania, and that he would release all Polish prisoners of war. Another clause provided that, in Latin, terra suas Lithuaniae et Russii regis Poloniae perpetuo applicare, often rendered something along the lines of join in perpetuity his Lithuanian and Ruthenian lands to the crown of the Kingdom of Poland. But the meaning of applicare has been disputed ever since, and will eventually cause problems. The disagreement continues to this day. The term was never officially defined, and some scholars claim that it was intentionally used to avoid having a concrete meaning. In Polish historiography, it's been interpreted that either Lithuania ceased to exist and became a Polish province, or that while it continued to exist, it became a fief of Poland, that is, its subordinate. The Lithuanian view has always been that it was and remained a personal union, in which 2 states were united in the person of the monarch. Whether the ambiguity was intentional or not, The agreement was signed, and the following year the Szlachta and Polish clergy gathered in Lublin and accepted Jogaila as king. He continued on to Krakow, where he was baptized on 15th of February 1386, taking the name of Władysław. 3 days later he married Jadwiga, and on 4th of March he was crowned as King of Poland. Together they would found a new dynasty that will rule until the 16th century. Their union had enormous and far-reaching effects. Immediately it cut the ideological justification for the Crusades at a blow. If the Lithuanians were Christians, how could the Knights campaign for their extermination? It removed the threat to Poland from the east and stabilized the country overnight. Poland had been hamstrung for a couple of centuries by internal disputes, succession problems, risks of fragmentation and conquest, as well as conflict with Lithuania and the Knights. The Jagiellonian stability will see it bloom into a golden age. The personal union of Poland and Lithuania created the largest polity in Europe, dramatically reinforcing Lithuania and taking Poland's interest in the Rus Kняжество beyond the border territories. But the question of what the union actually meant will soon arise, and it will not always run smoothly. And the conversion to Catholicism undermined the basis for religious tolerance, which was the basis for Ruthene acquiescence to Lithuanian rule. Eventually, the Orthodox will begin to feel that they are second-class citizens. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.